This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. Scratchy recordings on vinyl, old cassettes in the corner of a storeroom, wax cylinders from museum archives. These are the voices of our past, fragile sounds that offer connections to history. They are the found stories, songs, and names that we long thought forgotten.
I see people sort of groping for something from the past to hold on to and to be proud of.
Today on Unreserved, we're listening to Found Sound, archival recordings of Indigenous languages, songs, and audio that captured a moment in time.
My name is Bert Crowfoot. Kaya Stoya is my Blackfoot name, and Kaya Talas is my Kwakwakal name. I'm originally from Siksika, Alberta. I'm half Blackfoot, half Saulteaux.
In 1982, Bert Crowfoot was working for the Alberta Native Communications Society. But when they lost their funding, the organization started liquidating its assets, and the Alberta government asked Crowfoot a rather unusual question: if he wanted the publication's entire archive. Boxes and boxes and boxes of interviews, photos, videos of elders, and traditional Cree and Dene ceremonies. Crowfoot bought them for $1. And they sat in a warehouse collecting dust for about 36 years. Now, in partnership with the University of Alberta, Crowfoot is dusting them off and archiving them digitally for people to access.
Kaya sinua kia chimuak tan spinstam ewa pahtamika saga steak. Ki sike sata kurchas ki e kia steak.
There's VHS, there's 3/4 inch video, half-inch video. And so a lot of the interviews are with elders, a lot of it in the language, Cree, Dene. A lot of it is for broadcast. So you know how frugal people were back in those days. They would take the same reel-to-reel and they would, after they'd finished, they'd use it again and just record over it. So sometimes in the middle of the interview, it breaks back to the old interview and then it goes back, and so
I see no esa nesta eki papam tachimot I is no eki nepau.
Indigenous people, our way of preserving and saving stuff is telling stories. And a lot of times I could sit here and just tell you a story, and I'll tell you maybe some spiritual stories. You know, if you look over at this image, you know, do you see a bear up in the smoke on the upper right-hand corner? Do you see a wolf in the smoke in this corner? And I can tell you about those stories just sitting here. But unless I actually show you those images and the story behind those images, it's much more powerful when you do it that way. So I can tell you stories about Dr. Anna and how she did a story in Korean and then she did a story in English, right? And that doesn't have as much impact as actually listening to Dr. Ann Anderson telling those stories in her, 80-ish old voice that's, didn't want to say creaking, but, how old elders talk, and so she has that kind of voice. And to actually hear her talk, I think is so powerful. And the message for our young people. I mean, our young people today are so digitized. I mean, they can sit there and do anything with computers, with laptops, with phones, with all kinds of stuff, right? And it's actually trying to teach our elders how to use this technology so that they can start preserving some of the stuff, some of the knowledge that they have. What happens with archives is you have to keep updating the format, like what technology is it on? Originally we had floppy disks, then zip drives, and then CDs, and CDs are going out, and so are memory sticks. I mean, those are going out too. So what happens if you've got archives and if it's stored in one format, it soon becomes obsolete, and all that information can be lost again. So you need to keep it in a place that it's continually updated, the technology is updated, and that's what I like about our deal with the University of Alberta. It'll be stored in a place where when technology changes, it'll slowly be migrated over to the new technology.
Maga e sa mitoni mi cheta yawak, Haida Gwaii pie sisak, apchika kagi sak, kasi katichik.
In 1960, the Siksika people held their last Sundance. And what they did was they went to the Glenbow Museum and asked them to come out and record all the songs, to film all the ceremonies, to make sure that it wasn't lost. They wanted to preserve this. And the Glenbow Museum has kept all of this information in storage, and no one has access to it unless permission is given by the Blackfoot cultural societies. And then in 2000, Siksika wanted to bring back their Sundance. And there's 4 nations in the Blackfoot Confederacy. And the 4 nations are the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, and the Southern Pagan in Montana. But our Sundances are a little bit different, even within the Blackfoot Confederacy. A lot of the other Sundances had some outside influences like Sioux, and a lot of with people going to different ceremonies, things changed, and they wanted to keep their Sundance or their ceremonies the way it was. And so they went to the Glenbow and they brought back all the songs, all the ceremonies, and everything intact, the same as it was 40 years before. And so to me, that's an awesome way of doing it, to make sure that, intellectual and cultural knowledge is preserved and kept in the right hands. This platform, once we've got it developed, we want to make it available, or it should be available to different First Nations or organizations who want to set up their own databases.
Magakiano, namoyo sam kemi mano PACs. We to go PAC si katao ayese papam muat kotaga PAC sa miswite what's dunsi. So squash pagwate kusu. This is Ann Anderson.
That was Ann Anderson speaking Cree. It's one of the thousands of archival recordings being digitized by Bert Crowfoot and the University of Alberta's Institute for Sound Studies. For more information, visit our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Coming up, how a woman from Vienna helped preserve the sacred songs of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation during the time of the potlatch ban.
My contacts led me finally to Chief Billy Assou. He was a very powerful and clever and wise chief of the Kwakiutl Indians in Cape March. And at the time, the potlatch were forbidden. The government didn't allow them to sing really their songs or to exercise their tribal functions. So I asked him, Chief Billy, what will it be if you die? All your songs will be lost. And he was very sad about it and said yes. So I explained to him what I would like to do. I would like to preserve these songs and to keep the music alive.
That story in just a few minutes. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, listening to archival and found sound on the show today, like this. What you're listening to is a rare recording of Chief Mungo Martin. He's from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation in British Columbia. The song is called The Mink Song. The recording of that song is currently housed at the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, along with hundreds of others collected by ethnomusicologist Ida Halpern. Unreserved's Stephanie Cram came across this collection and joins me to discuss its importance. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi.
So tell me, how did you find out about this collection?
Well, when I found out we were putting together a show on found sound, it got me wondering if Canada has its very own Alan Lomax.
And who would that be?
He's an American ethnomusicologist who traveled around the United States starting in the 1930s, collecting folk songs from various communities, including Black communities in the South and the Appalachian region in the United States. He's probably most famously known as the person who discovered blues singer Leadbelly.
And so, did you find somebody in Canada?
Yes. In my research, I came across Haida Gwaii, who is from Vienna, and she traveled to Canada with the strict purpose to gather songs from the West Coast First Nations. In 1967, she spoke to CBC and explained what brought her to Canada.
Well, you see, I was always very interested, of course, in folklore. And as we came here, it was quite interesting. The immigration officer asked, do you have any plans to do? And I said, yes, I would like to collect Indian music. And he just laughed. He said, oh, you better look for something else than that. So people didn't take that really serious. And still, you have a culture here, an exciting culture, and nobody tapped it. Nobody did anything about it. The reason might have been also that it was very hard to get to the Indians, because Indian music for the Indian represents a very sacred part. It is part of their tradition, it is part of their religion, of their rites and ceremonies. Therefore, they are not allowing anybody to enter that and to participate.
Interesting. So did she just hop on a plane to Canada to gather sacred songs? She must have had some hurdles along the way.
Oh, yes, most definitely. It was not a simple job. It took a lot of patience and understanding. When she first arrived to Canada, she embedded herself in an Indian village near Anderson, BC, where she formed bonds with the community before asking to hear their songs. In 1967, she told CBC's Otto Lowy about the first time she heard someone from the community sing and how it didn't quite turn out how she expected.
How did you get to the Indian villages? Where did you get advice from? How did you begin?
Well, I began the hard way. For instance, there was one time we went to Anderson Lake, and there was an Indian village. I found out who is the best singer of the Indian village. So I was pointed out to one old lady. So I tried to befriend her. And you see, the Indians are a little suspicious of white people. Rightly so, I think. And they didn't know what I wanted. So you have to gain their confidence. I went every day there. I helped her with her chores. I helped her peel potatoes until we became friendly. And I told her that I would like very much to listen to her singing. I heard she has a beautiful voice, and she always bashfully said, no. After 10 days persistence and visiting her always, finally she said, today I will sing for you. At that time we didn't have any tape recorders or wire recorders even, and not even the recording machines. So I took paper and pencil, and excited I sat down and listened. And here she started to sing, and what do you think did I hear? Christian hymns. Well, of course, I couldn't show her my great disappointment, so I said, oh no, I would like your old songs, your old Indian songs. And she said, oh no, these she would never sing. Oh no, these are sacred.
What I love so much about how Haida talks about the time she spent gaining the trust of the people in the Indian village is how she's aware that First Nation people at the time were suspicious of outsiders.
Yeah, that really stood out for me too. It was kind of hilarious that she started singing Christian music. And these recordings were collected in the 1940s when residential schools were still operating. I take it that added to the suspicion she felt from First Nations.
Yes, residential schools were likely a factor, but this was also a time when the potlatch ban was still in place, which is a law that made it illegal for First Nations to practice their culture. The first person Halpern was able to convince to share their songs with her was Kwakwakwayak Chief Billy Asu from the Weewaquay Nation. Both Halpern and Asu were aware of how risky it was for them to record these songs.
My contacts led me finally to Chief Billy Asu. He was a very powerful and clever and wise chief of the Kwakiutl Indians in Cape March. And at the time, the potlatch were forbidden. the government didn't allow them to sing really their songs or to exercise their tribal functions. So as I met him and we started to talk, and I asked him, do his sons know their music? Because he was a songmaker of his tribe. And he said no. So I asked him, Chief Billy, what will it be if you die? All your songs will be lost. And he was very sad about that and said yes. So I explained to him what I would like to do. I would like to preserve these songs and to keep the music alive. You see, you must understand, nobody else is allowed to sing his songs. So it is not that if he dies, somebody else would sing it, because these songs belong to him. He bought them, he inherited them by marriage, by his mother. He owns these songs, and nobody else is allowed to sing these songs. Finally, he saw the reason for it, and he said, you come, I'll sing. And he invited me to stay with him at Cape March. And he sang for me day and night. And he said, I'll sing you 100 songs. And he nearly kept word. He sang 88 for me.
It sounds like Chief Asu had built a trust with Halpern.
Yes, she developed deep bonds with the people she worked with. And in fact, when she donated her recordings and other research material to the BC archives in the 1980s, she wanted to guarantee that her work would not cause harm to the communities. Here's Genevieve Weber from the Royal BC Museum describing the arrangement Halpern made with the museum before turning over her collection.
In her donor agreement with BC Archives in the 80s, she makes it very clear that the songs are first and foremost for the Indigenous communities from which they came. She even lists a hierarchy of researchers and how people should be allowed to access them, with non-Indigenous academic researchers at the very bottom of the list. She also states in her donor agreement that they should never be allowed to be used for anything that could cause harm to the communities that they're from. So the language and the way that she writes about it is quite different than a lot of the things that you see written from that time period. I think she was, I don't want to say ahead of her time, I think she was just aware and reasonable in a way that a lot of other people in positions like hers weren't.
That's very cool for that time. So, Steph, if I wanted to listen to the recordings at the museum, would I be able to?
Some of the recordings have been made available to the public, but many of the recordings deal with ceremonies and are not to be shared publicly. Those recordings are only available for family members and other people from the communities. In fact, Genevieve Weber from the museum continues to connect with the families featured in the recordings.
When I first came to work at the archives about 3.5 years ago, I was assigned to work with this collection as we were beginning to prepare to submit it to UNESCO for status on the UNESCO Documentary Heritage Register, the Memory of the World Register. And part of that process was connecting with communities that these songs came from. And there's a number of places that they came from. So Halpern recorded quite a few singers. There's about 330 songs altogether, and that covers singers from Haida Gwaii, Kwakwaka'wakw territory on Vancouver Island, Chalmers territory on Vancouver Island. And when I was trying to reach out to some of those communities, I was really lucky to form a relationship with some of the descendants from Chief Billy Asu. And we're working together to come up with an agreement that will recognize their family's inherent ownership of the information captured in the songs. So although the Royal BC Museum and Archives is considered the owner of the material, the songs themselves are sacred and important songs that they have ownership and control over, and that control should be handed back into the family.
The Asu family has requested to go through all the audio recordings, so for the time being, those recordings are not available to the public.
Genevieve also mentioned the tapes received UNESCO status. What does that mean?
In 2018, the Ida Halpern collection was accepted into the Canada Memory of the World Register, which is a collection of artifacts of great importance for Canadian history. This can include video, audio, photography, and even documents. The register has brought a lot of attention to the importance of the Halpern recordings and will safeguard them for years to come.
Well, that is amazing. Thank you so much for being our Found Sound nerd, Steph.
No problem.
Let's take a listen to another of Chief Mungo recordings from the Halpern collection. Here's the thank you song.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Hem khasli, nukwa ningla, nukwa kola am, hai samaikis,
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Coming up, how one totem pole changed the course of history on Haida Gwaii.
Are we ready? Ho-hee!
And why one Haida filmmaker searched for archival recordings to tell that story.
Ho-hee! Once more.
That's the voice of Robert Thompson singing the Canoe Song, a very old and sacred song of the Anishinaabe people. Born in 1876, Thompson was a medicine man, mill worker, and fiddler who lived at Chiefs Point Reserve in southern Ontario. He recorded songs and stories on wax cylinders and lacquered discs with his friend and neighbor, Dr. Edwin Seaborn. This was in 1930 when singing, dancing, and traditional practice were outlawed under the Indian Act. The recordings were hidden away, untouched for decades, until now, 85 years later. Thanks to Bimadashka Anya Pukan. She is Anishinaabe from Saugeen First Nation in southern Ontario, and she has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Western Ontario. Welcome.
Thank you, miigwech.
So, Bimadashka, this has been a really long journey for you, one that began almost 10 years ago, and it was a journey that you weren't even sure you wanted to take. How did you first learn about the existence of these recordings?
I have a passion for the War of 1812, and I've always tried to learn more about the Anishinaabe involvement. At Western, I took a reading course designed to dig deeper into the records, into the archival records, and my professor, Dr. Rick Fair, gave me a book to read. It was written by Dr. Edwin Seaborn, published in 1944. And in this book, Dr. Seaborn captured a narrative of a medicine man from the Sauble River, and he told the story about the death of Tecumseh. The Sauble River is it runs just north of Saugeen First Nation and just south of Chiefs Point Indian Reserve, which is another one of our communities. And I knew immediately that these stories belonged to my people. Mm-hmm. There were two sentences that matched almost exactly to a story my grandmother had told me when I was a little girl. Two men from Saugeen were fighting the Chimokman. The Chimokman would be the Americans. Mm-hmm. And the Chimokman were pursuing them. And these two men hid in a hole in the ground, and they could hear the soldiers walking around on top of them. Now, when I'd read this account in Dr. Seaborn's book, the old medicine man says that these two gentlemen, one being his grandfather, these two men had shape-shifted into turtles and hid under a log, and they could hear the soldiers walking around on top of them. Mm-hmm. And so it was immediately when I read that, my hair stood up. I felt like I could hear my grandmother's voice saying the words in my ear. Following the narrative, Dr. Seaborn writes that he made audio recordings with this gentleman at the University of Western Ontario. And my professor and I had talked, and he encouraged me to say, and he said, don't you want to listen to these recordings? Mm-hmm. Don't you want to see if you can find them? And at first, honestly, I didn't want to know.
How come? Why didn't you? What gave you pause about it?
I've been raised up as a dancer, powwow dancer. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents attending elders gatherings. My grandfather is a chief, Chief James Mason. I got to spend a lot of time with old people in my young life. I learned a lot about medicine, from medicine people. I have an incredible respect, and I understand the great power that Mishkeke, the Anishinaabe medicine, has. And so even then I sort of feared the power, I suppose, that could be contained in those recordings. And I spent a lot of time speaking with my family back home, elders, community members. And I wasn't the only one who was hesitant at first. We don't record our traditional or our sacred knowledge in our sacred songs. We don't do that. And so how could these recordings exist? So one, if they are sacred, then we need to be very careful of how we deal with them. The other is if they're not sacred, then there should be no problem for us to listen to them. Mm-hmm. And so we were still stuck with this. We don't know what's really on them, and we have to hear them so that we can make a good decision in moving forward. And I'm so grateful to Museum London that they're willing to work with us.
Which is where ultimately you found them. So what did you do once you decided that you would pursue this?
The next part was then to research wax cylinders, the technology, the issues with them today. So because they're so old and they're wax, they grow a mold on them. And the mold gouges out sections of the recording. It makes the recordings very, very fragile. Mm-hmm. Temperature shifts can crack the wax cylinders. And the fact that, too, that once you play them, putting a needle into the groove, it every time they're played, they're damaged more and more. So we didn't want to play them either. So what we did was we found a company in the United States called the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Maryland. We sent the recordings of the wax cylinders and the lacquer discs that were a part of the collection. We sent those down to Maryland. They digitized them with a laser, created a 3D image, and then used a statistical algorithm called Irene to read these images into a digital file, into sound.
Once you got the digital recordings back and you were able to finally sit down and listen to them, how did you react when you finally heard the voice of Robert Thompson?
When I first heard his voice, I screamed, "I can hear you!" And I really did scream loud. And I was crying tears. I'd finally gotten, what I was looking for. I felt an incredible connection.
So once you finally got the recordings, what did you find were on them?
They're a wide collection, I guess, of a lot of different stuff. So certainly we have there are incredibly powerful and sacred songs. Those are not shared publicly. Those stay within the community. There are songs that the community has decided can be publicly available for people to access and learn from. But there's also stuff on there like where Dr. Seaborn is complaining and he says, test, test, test. Fred Coates didn't show up today to work this machine, so now I'm trying to work it. You hear the machine click off. So listening to these, the 19 different recordings, they're not just songs and stories. Certainly I hear Robert singing, but I even hear Dr. Seaborn get really enthusiastic, and he makes like these hoka. And it's almost as if he's singing and cheering along. Mm-hmm. The other coolest thing about this, nowhere in the published document, nowhere in Seaborn's records did I find any clue that this was going to happen. But on the recordings is Robert Thompson's wife, Elizabeth, and she translates the concepts into English. So she's a very vital piece to Dr. Seaborn's work with Robert Thompson, because she's the one who is mediating the information going back and forth between the two gentlemen. Now,
you have said that you felt like you rescued your ancestors. What did you mean by that?
I'd planned a week of workshops with elders and community members to reintroduce the music and the songs, the stories. But my driving home, it's about 2.5 hours to 3 hours out of London up to Saugeen. And as I drove home, I really had this sense that I had a sense of victory, that we won. I rescued my ancestors. I was bringing them home. They were finally free. That was a very, very powerful moment for me.
Now, interestingly, you have a personal connection beyond just a general ancestry returning to the territories. You have a really interesting connection, which you alluded to earlier when you mentioned the turtle shape-shifting story. And it was one of many strange coincidences that you had experienced on this journey. What is that connection?
An important part for me was to do the genealogy. So I wanted to understand Robert's authority to record this information. So when I did the genealogy back to 1800, back into the War of 1812, and yes, I did find Robert Thompson's grandfather's name is Gwaii, and he did receive a medal for his service in the War of 1812 from the British. And finding the records of Gwaii, the person that he was fighting alongside was a man named Mandawab, and that is my great-great-grandfather. It's just incredible. I had no idea.
I got goosebumps.
It is so powerful and amazing, this project. When you talked about coincidences.
Yeah.
Another one was the recordings had been in a family member's basement for decades. And in 1975, the family decided to donate them to Museum London. Now, 1975 is also the year that I was born. And I even had this sense that when I started to move in the world, the wax cylinder started to move. So together, it's almost as if my entire life had been pre-planned for this work to happen. Yeah. It's very, very strange and beautiful.
Thank you so much for your time today, Bimadoshka.
Thank you.
Bimadoshka Pukan is Anishinaabe from Saugeen First Nation in southern Ontario. She is the curator for Voices of Chiefs Point.
I would go and visit the elders, and they seemed really kind of not connecting to anything. And I could feel the sadness, and I wanted to create an occasion for them to celebrate one more time. That was the moment I committed to carving the totem pole. After I made the commitment to carve the pole, I had no idea on what was involved. And I remember getting a phone call from my dad. He said, "I found a log for you." I said, "Oh, yeah, right, I need a log."
That's the voice of internationally renowned Haida carver Robert Davidson, reflecting back on the first totem pole he ever carved. A totem pole that changed everything in Haida Gwaii. On a sunny Friday in August in 1969, the people of Old Masset Village raised that totem pole, the first in nearly a century. That day was captured in a 1970 National Film Board documentary called That Was the Time. 50 years after that film's release, Haida filmmaker Christopher Akhter retells that story in his own NFB film called Now Is the Time. He unearthed archival audio recordings from the pole raising to reframe the film, to tell it from a Haida perspective. He joins me from Vancouver. Christopher, welcome.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So tell me, what were the issues with the original film?
Some of the impact of hearing firsthand accounts, like from the people who actually lived these events. Instead, it was done through a narrator. And I don't know, I guess especially for this particular story, it just seemed for me to have impact, to have those that lived that time. It was important for me to have them explain the story.
So you're saying that the Haida voice was completely omitted from the piece?
Yeah, and I think as well the perspective, I think, was apparent that it didn't come from a Haida person's perspective.
Yeah, so how then did remaking the film send you on your hunt for the archival recordings?
Well, there were so many questions that came up. One was, this event seemed to carry with it so much impact for us in terms of regenerating a reinsurgence of our art forms in all the different ways and culture, like the songs, the dances, the potlatches. Why did carving a pole and raising it, why did it have that much of an impact? The other question for me was, well, what happened to the totem poles in the first place? There's these beautiful pictures that I see in textbooks of our communities. Our villages were just packed full of totem poles. Well, what happened to them? Did they all end up in museums and were taken away or sold or things like that? That was one of the things that was missing from the National Film Board's archives, is we had all this beautiful footage, but we didn't have the audio recordings. We just had what was burnt into the original film.
So pictures, but no sound.
Yeah.
So you don't know what's going on there.
No, and you can see that there's speeches going on. There's lots going on. I want to know, after all this time, what's being said, what's it like? But we were missing all that, and so I didn't have the full puzzle yet. So I was searching really hard. I calling radio stations, like in Terrace, because I could see in pictures that there's lots of news crew up there and lots of people with recording equipment. I said it must be somewhere. And the radio said, no. I'd asked people at home, do you know anybody that had recording equipment? No. Through talking with Robert, he mentioned Imbert Orchard. He did a radio program, and that he interviewed him, and he was up there. And so I was like, okay. So I did a search on the BC archives, and it came up, and I traveled over to Victoria. My sister Nikita came in with me, and we were listening to the tapes, and they were so fascinating. Then it just fell off my seat when I heard it. Was Joe Weir's account of what happened to the totem poles, and I just did not even fathom that I would find a first-hand account of what happened to the totem poles. It was amazing.
We actually have a clip of that. Let's take a listen to that audio recording that you dug up from the BC archives. This is Haida elder Joe Weir speaking about the forest of totem poles on Haida Gwaii and how they were destroyed. It was recorded by CBC journalist Imbert Orchard.
The missionary says, if they don't get rid of these totem poles, you never go to heaven. That's what the minister told the Indians. So they want all the Indians get together, cut all the totem poles down and burn them up. And Indians all got together and started cut them down. I used to help too, I want to go to heaven. Cut them all down, cut them in about 4-foot lengths, something you can lift. And cut them all up and split them and make big fire and burn them.
Just listening to that is heartbreaking. What was it like for you to hear that recording of Joe Weir?
The fact that he went into detail about, cutting them into 4-foot lengths so that they could carry them. And you can't trade these types of recordings for any amount of gold. It's like they're priceless. Like they're just so valuable. Being able to understand their experiences from their point in history and trying to understand their time period in which they lived and just the sheer amount of change that they lived through. And this oozing knowledge that they had and being able to share that with us so that we can carry it on and build back up on the foundation that they reset for all of us. So it was so important for me to be able to hear those audio tapes and still like going back over those tapes and picking up new nuances in terms of what they were talking about. It's just so fascinating.
Yeah. So in order to tell this story, the whole story, you spent hours poring over old recordings at the BC archives. Can you set the scene for me? What were you looking for?
I was looking for things that would fill in those gaps in terms of my own knowledge, and I wanted to know what the mindset was in that time.
So having had glimpsed that window, why then was this totem pole rising so significant?
Well, it was significant in that it showed everybody that it was okay to do it again, that it was okay to bring your culture back out and into the open, into the sunshine, from the shadows, so to speak, because, nobody's getting arrested. Nobody's being punished for it or looked down upon for doing it, because there was the potlatch ban, there was the residential schools, the smallpox. Many, many communities all throughout Haida Gwaii just in survival mode.
Yeah.
So you're in survival mode and missionaries tell you, well, you're going to go to hell for eternity if you don't get rid of the totem poles. Being encouraged to get rid of everything that has to do with Haida culture.
There's a beautiful moment in your film that touched me deeply when that day happens and you see the elders coming out into the sunshine with their button blankets and they're wearing paper hats, recreations of Haida masks. And for me, that just sort of said it all.
Yeah, it's just extremely powerful to see how proud they were. There was still a lot of love and effort put into these paper headdresses, made out of cardboard, and others made out of paper. Toy drums to beat on. There wasn't any of the beautiful gujau drum that you would see today. Just the pride in being able to know this is who we are, and we're going to display it any way that we can.
Yeah. Let's take a listen to another clip you found in those recordings. This is Haida scholar Barbara Wilson speaking to CBC reporter Bert Crowfoot in 1969, the day after the totem pole was raised.
I feel very sad about it in a lot of ways because I see people sort of groping for something from the past to hold on to and to be proud of. And I think yesterday, I think you felt it, I felt it, and many more of us felt it. For those 2 or 3 seconds when that pole first stood up, there was a real sense of, this is us. For those few little seconds, this was us. Let's stand up a little taller, and maybe it didn't last. For me, I think it will.
That's a clip from the archival tape that Haida filmmaker Christopher Akhter brought into his documentary, Now is the Time. Can you describe that clip for us?
Yeah, well, that was another one of those clips that just about floored me in terms of it being such a special clip that it really illustrated the mindset of the time. The fact that this pole could go up, this beautiful pole, and there'd be a potlatch and all the ceremony and the songs are coming out, the dances. But Barbara thinks that, and I'm sure lots of others thought that this could be the last time we see this. That poignancy of the mindset, this totally foreign thought for me, being born 11 years after this date in a time where there was these songs and dances. My Uncle Mike making these beautiful bear masks and, being able to wear them. And I was surrounded by it. To be able to hear that, nope, it wasn't so long before that they could have all fallen over the cliff and we could be maybe in a different time right now.
Yeah. So have elders like Barbara Wilson and Robert Davidson seen your film?
Oh, yeah. Both of them have seen it. We did a Haida Gwaii tour of the film, went to all the schools and did 2 community screenings and went to the Skidegate Haida Immersion Program where the elders are recording the language and Elder Center up in Masset. Mm-hmm. Barbara, the most beautiful thing for me is that she says that she feels vindicated. That's what she said. So I can't feel more proud than that.
Vindicated in so many ways, right? Mm-hmm. Finally seeing the voices return to this film, finally seeing, the Haida culture brought back must be amazing for you.
Yeah. We have quite in terms of the Haida people, we have people of the time that were younger back then that have really stepped up and become great leaders for us and for, this younger generation to really be able to continue on and have given us an avenue to be able to create in our art forms and explore our stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Christopher. I'm going to go watch it again.
Great.
Christopher Akhter is a Haida filmmaker. His NFB documentary, Now is the Time, is now available to stream at New York Times Op Docs. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Zoe Tennant, Kyle Musica, and Anna Lazowski. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I go say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.